She was a girl who was sold, treated like property, yet she became the mother whose pride and perseverance created the Tudor dynasty. They stole her only child from her for 14 long years. She faced execution for treason. But Margaret never broke. She waited, she manipulated, and in the end, she won. But the final tragedy was more painful than war itself. After crowning her son, she had to watch him die. 2 months after his death, her heart broke, and she died too. This is the story of the woman who used blood, tears, and iron will to rewrite history. Do you think a woman who went through such hell has the right to be ruthless? Let's find out. Margaret Beaufort was born in 1443, with blood considered both precious and cursed. She was descended from King Edward III, but her Beaufort lineage carried a permanent stain. Her grandparents were born out of wedlock. Although later legitimized, Parliament added a cruel clause. The Beaufort family was permanently barred from inheriting the throne. She inherited royal blood, but was forbidden from wearing the crown. This made her a perfect pawn, valuable for marriage, but not a threat. When Margaret was 1 year old, her father died, likely by suicide due to political failure. She became the richest female heiress in England. Instantly, powerful men fought over her. At 6, she was forced to marry John de la Pole, the Earl of Suffolk's son. 3 years later, the marriage was annulled. She learned her first lesson. She was a commodity, not a person. At 12, she was pushed into the fateful marriage with Edmund Tudor, King Henry VI's half-brother. Edmund didn't care she was a child. He needed an immediate heir. The marriage was consummated. By late April 1456, Margaret conceived. She was not yet 13. But Edmund never met his son. The Wars of the Roses swallowed him. Edmund was captured, caught the plague, and died in November 1456. Margaret was 12, pregnant, and widowed. She faced the next horror, childbirth in adolescence. The tragedy did not stop. On the 28th of January 1457, Margaret went into labor. She was only 13 years old. Her body was underdeveloped. The labor was agonizing, lasting hours, perhaps days, in agony that medieval medicine could not ease. Historians believe she was lucky to survive. She screamed, she bled, she was near death, only to finally deliver a tiny baby boy, Henry Tudor. That birth permanently damaged Margaret's body. She would never be able to bear another child. That lingering physical pain became a daily reminder that she had only one chance, one heir to protect. This pain hardened her iron will. She knew that if Henry were taken or died, her lineage and all her suffering would be meaningless. Soon after, Margaret married for the 3rd time to Henry Stafford. This time, Margaret was not the passive bride. She married for strategy for Henry's security and future. She hoped for peace, but the Wars of the Roses worsened. The Lancastrians were defeated. King Edward IV took the throne. In 1461, Edward IV seized the throne. He spared Margaret and her husband, but stole the most important thing, Henry Tudor. The 4-year-old boy was stripped of his title and handed over to William, Lord Herbert, a loyal Yorkist, to be raised as one of their own. For Margaret, who could never bear another child, being separated from her only son was a living death. Margaret had no power or voice, but she began a silent strategy. She remarried Thomas, Lord Stanley, a powerful noble and Edward IV's favorite. The purpose of this marriage was clear. It was a shield. Margaret used Stanley's loyalty as a cover to stay near the court where decisions were made. For 14 long years, she lived under the guise of an obedient Yorkist noblewoman. She attended every event, but inside, she was a spy for her son. How did Margaret stay in contact with Henry, who was under custody and later exiled? Margaret is believed to have used monks and extremely loyal private secretaries. Messages were encrypted and passed through pilgrimages, visits, or hidden in seemingly innocuous correspondence. Every warning, every strategic advice that reached Henry in Brittany came from the mother who never stopped fighting. She knew that Henry Tudor was the last surviving Lancastrian and a prime target for the Yorkists, especially after the deaths of other royals. In 1470, the Lancastrians briefly regained the throne. Margaret and 13-year-old Henry reunited. It was a moment of intense emotion. At a dinner, King Henry VI, Margaret's brother-in-law, looked at young Henry Tudor and spoke a strange prophecy. This boy will be king one day. That planted a burning ambition in Margaret's mind, legitimized by a king. But joy was short-lived. Edward IV swiftly returned, crushing the Lancastrians permanently. Henry VI was assassinated. Henry Tudor became the last surviving Lancastrian claimant. He was target number 1 for the York House. Margaret urgently sent a final message to her son. Do not accept any pardon. Run. Henry and his uncle fled to Brittany, beginning 14 years of dangerous exile. Margaret would not see him again until he was king. In 1483, Edward IV died suddenly. The prince's uncle, Richard III, seized the throne, and the 2 children, the princes in the tower, vanished. This mysterious death changed the game entirely. Previously, Margaret had hoped Henry could return peacefully, but now she realized a terrifying truth. A tyrant who could murder his own nephews would never spare anyone who threatened his crown. Homicide was the line Richard crossed. Margaret knew Henry would never be safe while Richard lived. Margaret made the most ruthless and strategic decision of her life. She partnered with Elizabeth Woodville, the murdered prince's mother. If Elizabeth Woodville suspected Margaret of killing her sons, this alliance would never have happened. This is powerful evidence that Margaret understood Richard III was the common enemy. Margaret's plan: legitimize Henry through marriage. She arranged for Henry Tudor to marry Elizabeth Woodville's eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York. This alliance would not only legitimize Henry's weak claim, but also symbolize the end of the bloody Wars of the Roses. She transformed her son from an exiled nobody into the symbol of peace and unity. The first rebellion was a disaster. Margaret was captured. Richard III, knowing she committed treason, had every right to execute her. But Margaret won her sole strategic gamble, her marriage to Thomas Stanley. Richard III dared not kill Margaret for fear of losing Stanley's military support. He merely stripped her of assets and confined her under Stanley's custody. Richard made the fatal error. He let his enemy live. For 14 years, Margaret had carefully cultivated the pride of Thomas Stanley. She constantly reminded him of the honor and power of being the stepfather of a potential king. Stanley was Margaret's secret asset. By August 1485, Henry Tudor landed in Wales. At Bosworth Field, the 2 armies met. Thomas Stanley and his brother, William, held back, waiting to see who would win. That was the tensest moment in English history. Everything Margaret had sacrificed, the terrifying birth, 14 years of loneliness, the threat of beheading depended on Stanley's decision. And finally, William Stanley committed his forces to Henry. Richard III was killed. Lord Stanley picked up the fallen crown and placed it on Henry Tudor's head. Victory was hers. Margaret Beaufort was now My Lady the King's mother, the most powerful woman who had transformed an exiled teenager into King Henry VII. She used her power to build her legacy, founding Cambridge colleges, Christ's College and Street, John's College, and supporting scholars. She signed documents as Margaret R., Regina, Queen, a subtle assertion of the power she earned. She had won. She had built the Tudor dynasty. But the tragic story was not over. In April 1509, Henry VII fell ill and died at age 52. The son she had fought her entire life to protect was finally taken by death. Margaret's grief was overwhelming. The mother who could have no other children was now utterly childless, isolated, purposeless, and plagued by her lingering physical pain. The woman who had survived everything finally gave up. Margaret Beaufort died on June 29, 1509, just 2 months after her son. The fighter who had cheated death at 13 could not endure the loss at 66. Margaret Beaufort proved that a mother's love can change history but ultimate victory comes at an unforgiving personal cost. The life of Margaret Beaufort is a testament. Was she history's greatest mother or its most ruthless manipulator? She used everything she had, her life, her honor, even her eternal pain, to place Henry VII on the throne, creating Henry VIII and the dynasty that changed the world. She proved that survival is its own kind of victory, and a mother's love can change history. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. After hearing this tale of survival and tragedy, do you see Margaret Beaufort as a heroine or a villain? And if you want to explore more dramatic flows of history like this, be sure to subscribe and share the Flow of History channel so you don't miss the next untold story. Thank you for watching.